The ice machine at Pike Hollow put out about 300 pounds a day in August, and in 19 summers I never once beat Marcus Fenn to it. He'd be standing at the store porch at 5:30 with a little blue cooler under his arm, waiting for me to walk down the hill with the keys so he could ice down his insulin before the heat got into the day. He'd been doing it since 2004. Same cooler, same spot, same joke about how the campground owed him a stool. On the 9th of August, the bin was scraped clean. Not low. Clean, down to the wet steel, with the auger still turning, and a fresh half-shelf of cubes just starting to build up in the corner. Whoever did it had run the scoop until it clanked and then used their hands because there were finger drags in the frost on the bin wall. The store door was still locked. The machine sits outside under the porch roof, which is the kind of thing you don't think about for 19 years until the one morning it matters. Marcus came around the corner right behind me with his cooler and looked in and said, "Huh. That's all, huh?" He was 61, built like a man who'd spent 40 years walking up and down the legs of a grain elevator. And he had a way of taking bad news, like a weather report. There was a $20 bill folded under the store door. Whoever took the ice had paid for 2 bags and taken about 50. I went inside and got Marcus 2 bags out of the chest freezer. The last 2 we had bagged and frozen from the day before. And he packed his cooler and thanked me, and I told him not to. Then I followed the water. That's the thing nobody thinks about when they steal ice in the dark. It melts. There was a wet line up the gravel from the machine to the upper loop, spaced out in drips. And it took me 8 minutes to walk it to Site 31, where a gray minivan was parked crooked across the pad with a mattress bungeed to the roof rack. And no tent, no chairs, no fire ring set up, nothing. 2 kids asleep in the back seat with the windows down. 4 big coolers on the picnic table, all 4 packed to the lid with ice and nothing else in them. No food, no drinks, just ice. A man was sitting on the bench with his shoes on, awake, watching me come. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what you'd have kept cold, because future stories come from ideas subscribers leave. His name was Alan Bircher. He had a wedding ring and a pharmacy polo shirt and hands that would not stay still. He said they'd come out from Ostrander around 3 in the morning, and he'd paid for the ice, and he'd pay for more. I asked him what he wanted with 4 coolers of ice and no food. He said, "Because there isn't going to be any." I want to be fair to him. He didn't tell me a wild story. He told me the county road out of Ostrander had been backed up since midnight, and that the hospital had put up sawhorses at the ambulance bay, and that his wife's cousin was a dispatcher and had stopped answering. That was all. He was a man who worked behind a pharmacy counter and understood, before most people did, that a lot of what keeps folks alive has to stay cold, and that cold is the first thing that goes. I told him he could stay. I told him to move the van off the grass. That's the extent of what I did that morning that anybody would call a decision. Pike Hollow sits at the bottom of a mile of county gravel on the west arm of Sable Lake in Delp County. And I'd been the caretaker there since I was 29. The Lamb family owns it. They live in Florida and call twice a year. 40 sites on 2 loops, upper with electric, lower down by the water for tents. A camp store the size of a 2-car garage that sells worms and marshmallows and rain ponchos at a markup. A bathhouse with the well pump and the pressure tank in a closet off the back. A boat ramp, a dock, 12 rental boats chained to the shore. Behind the old caretaker's cabin, up in the ferns, a concrete spring box the size of a bathtub that a farmer built in 1931 to keep milk cans cold, still fed by the same hillside seep, still running 52 degrees in the middle of July. That spring box is why I'm telling you any of this. My daughter Nell was working the store that summer. She was 24 and had come back in May after her lease in Columbus ran out. And we had an arrangement where neither of us said the word temporary out loud. She's better with people than I am. She'd remember which kid got which flavor of freeze pop. By 7 that morning, she had the radio on the counter and the volume low. And by 8, the county emergency channel had stopped saying possible and started saying do not travel. We had 31 occupied sites. By 9, we had 11. I want you to picture that because it happened faster than any part of what came after. People broke camp in 20 minutes. They left tent stakes in the ground and left firewood stacked and left their trash bags hanging on the post. And they drove up the gravel in a line with their brake lights coming on and off. And every single one of them took their coolers with them. Of course they did. That's your food. You don't leave your cooler. At 9:12, the power went out. I know the minute because the store cooler has a wall clock over it that runs off the outlet. And it stopped. And it stayed stopped for the rest of the time I lived there. The well pump quit. The ice machine quit with a sound like a spoon in a disposal. The chest freezers went quiet. And the quiet in that store was so complete, I could hear the lake through the screen door. Marcus came up the hill about 10 minutes later and stood in the doorway and said, "You got a generator." I had a generator. A little contractor unit in the shed that I ran twice a summer when a storm knocked us down for an afternoon. 5 gallons of gas in the can and about 6 in the mower jug and whatever was in Denny's truck. Denny Voss was my summer hire, 22, mowed the loops and ran the boat rentals and could not be told anything. He came up on the four-wheeler while we were pulling the generator out and said the county road at the top of the hill had cars on it going both directions, which is not a thing that happens on County Road 9. Then he asked if he should go into Dell's Corner and get gas. That was the first argument. It lasted about 90 seconds. Corinne Rule settled it. Corinne was 66, retired from the school office in Ostrander. And she and her granddaughter Sadie had Site 8 down in the lower loop. A pop-up camper they'd been coming to for 4 years since Sadie's mother went into a program the second time. Corinne walked up in a windbreaker with her arms folded and said that if a boy on a four-wheeler went up that road, everybody on that road would know there was something down here worth coming to. Denny said she didn't know that. She said neither did he. And one of them was going to be wrong in public. I closed the gate. That's a swing pipe gate with a chain and a padlock. And I'd closed it maybe 6 times in 19 years, always in November. I closed it at 9:40 in the morning on the 9th of August, with 11 sites still occupied, and Alan Bircher's van up on 31, and Marcus stood there and watched me do it and didn't say anything. And I registered that. And then I forgot about it for 2 days. Sadie Rule came up to the store at 11 with her cooler. She was 12, type 1 since she was 6. She kept her supply in a foam cooler with a cracked lid, and every morning of every summer she'd bring it up and swap it into the store's beverage cooler on the bottom shelf, where I kept a plastic bin for exactly that. Campers do it all the time. Somebody's got eye drops, somebody's got a bee sting kit, somebody's grandmother has a cardboard box with her name on masking tape. The bin lived on the bottom shelf behind the bait cups, and I'd been rotating it for years without thinking about it any harder than I thought about the propane cage. Sadie opened the cooler door and put her hand in and held it there and said, "It's warm." "It's an hour off," I said. "It'll hold most of the day if we don't open it." "It's already 61, she said, because she'd looked at the little dial thermometer taped inside, the one that came with the cooler, and she was the kind of kid who reads a dial. She had 3 unopened boxes and 1 pen in use, and a meter with about 40 test strips. She told me all of that standing there in flip-flops, in the same voice you'd use to tell somebody the score of a ball game. She'd been doing her own math since she was 9. Corinne handled the money and the driving, and Sadie handled Sadie. I told her I'd figure something out. She looked at me a second longer than a kid usually looks at an adult, and then she said okay, and went to find the Bircher kids. I have thought a lot about that extra second. Here's the part I have to say plain, because everything else sits on top of it. There was a third box in that bin. Mine. Type 2. Diagnosed 2 years and 4 months before, in the spring after my wife Dana died. Long-acting once a day, plus pills. I never told Nell. She was 22 and had just spent a year watching her mother get thinner in a chair by the window. And I sat in that pharmacy parking lot in Ostrander with the bag on the passenger seat, and I decided she'd had enough of that for a while. Then a month went by, and it got harder to say. And then a year went by, and there wasn't a way to say it that didn't sound like a lie I'd already told. So my box lived on the bottom shelf of the store cooler behind the bait cups, with no name on the tape. And I told myself that was just where a person keeps things. Marcus knew there was medicine in that bin. Everybody knew there was medicine in that bin. Nobody knew how many boxes. By 2 in the afternoon, I had the generator on the store, and I found out what I actually had. That little unit could run the 2 chest freezers, or it could run the beverage cooler and the lights, or it could run the well pump for about 20 minutes at a stretch to fill the bathhouse tank. It could not run the ice machine. Not for 1 second. Those machines pull a hard slug of current when the compressor kicks, and mine sat there and dropped the generator to a stall 3 times before I quit trying. Denny wanted to try again with the mower jug's gas, like the fuel was the problem. I want to be honest about how that felt, because it changed the shape of everything after. Every person standing in that yard had a picture in their head of Pike Hollow as a place with an ice machine. I'd sold ice off that porch for 19 years. It was the one thing we were known for on the West Arm. And it was gone at 2 in the afternoon on the first day. And it was never coming back. And the only people who understood that immediately were me and Alan Bircher, who had 4 coolers of it on a picnic table and had already known enough at 3 in the morning to go get it. We had 11 adults, 4 kids, 2 freezers full of thawing hamburger and popsicles, 5 gallons of gasoline plus change. A well we could only run in bursts, a lake we could boil out of, and 3 people whose insulin needed to stay cold. 2, as far as anybody else knew. I went up to the spring box that afternoon with a thermometer. It's a cheap Creel thermometer off the tackle rack. The kind with a yellow cord so you can drop it over the side of a boat, $4.99. And I'd used the same one for 6 years to write the water temp on the chalkboard by the door because the base guys asked every morning. It was in my shirt pocket most of my adult life. 52 degrees that box runs. In February, in August, in a drought, in a flood. 52. I've put my arm in it in the middle of a heat advisory and had to pull it out. The dial came up at 61. I stood there in the ferns and shook it and put it back in and waited longer and got 61 again. And then I looked at the overflow trough, which should have had a steady finger of water running out the notch and down through the moss. And there was no finger of water. There was a dark, wet stripe and a dribble. We'd had 11 days over 90 4/10 of an inch of rain since the middle of June. I'd known the seep was down. I'd said it out loud to Denny a week earlier. In the way you say a thing about weather. The box wasn't cold because the box wasn't moving. It was a concrete tub of standing water in the woods, warming up an inch a day. And the only reason I knew that, and nobody else did, was that I was the one who'd cleaned it every April since 1998, and I was the one with the thermometer in his pocket. I went back down and told them the spring was good, Not a lie yet. 61 is better than 94. And I didn't have anything else. And telling 15 people on day one that the last cold place on the property was failing wasn't going to make cold. That's what I said to myself walking down the hill. And it's what I'd say to you now. And I still think it's about half true. That evening, we did the coolers. I had everybody bring what they had to the store porch. And I want you to understand what turned up, because if you've never had to look at it all in one place, you'd assume the same thing everybody assumed. A campground has coolers. A campground is nothing but coolers. Every good cooler on that property drove up the gravel that morning with its owner. What was left was this. 2 display coolers off the store shelf. Foam, the kind that costs $11 and cracks if you sit on it. Sadie's foam one with a split lid. 3 old ones out of the maintenance shed that I'd been meaning to throw out for years, one with no lid at all, and 2 with the gaskets gone hard, and the hinges rusted through so that they sat crooked. A soft-sided bag out of Nell's car. 2 of Alan Bircher's, which were decent mid-range plastic, both already full of the ice he'd stolen, and already sweating in the shade. And Marcus Fenn's marine box. He'd bought it in the 90s, roto-molded, latches like a cooler for a boat, walls 2 inches thick, and he'd owned it so long the lid was chalked white from sun, and he'd written Fenn on the end in a paint pen that had mostly worn off. He used it for crappie. It sat under his awning at Site 14 all summer with a folded towel on top so people could sit on it. He carried it up the hill himself and set it on the porch boards and said, "Put the girls in first." He said that in front of everybody. First thing, before anybody proposed anything, before we'd even talked about how it was going to work. Put the girls in first. I put my hand on the lid, and I did the arithmetic in about 4 seconds, the way you do when you've handled a thing for 19 years. And here is what the arithmetic was. A cooler holds cold if it's full and closed. Half empty, it's a box of hot air with a lid. You need mass in there, ice or bottles or something. We had 1 real cooler and no way to make any more cold, which meant the ice on that porch was all the ice that would ever exist at Pike Hollow. And every hour it was going away. And what we were actually doing was not storing medicine. We were spending a fixed amount of cold as slowly as we could and hoping we spent it slower than the world took to get fixed. Sadie's 3 boxes and her pen. Marcus's 4 vials and 2 pens. My 5 vials. Alan Bircher, who did this for a living, said the number out loud without being asked. He said unopened in a house at room temperature. Most of it's good for about a month. Then it isn't. Not spoiled like milk, just weaker, and then weak. And there's no way to look at a vial and tell. Nobody says the last part enough. There's nothing to see. It doesn't turn color. You put it in, and it does less than it used to. And you don't find out until the numbers tell you. Marcus said, "Well, a month's a long time." Corinne said it wasn't, and that we should assume nobody was coming. And Marcus said assuming that was its own kind of decision. And the 2 of them went at it for a minute in the way people do when they both have a point. Corinne wanted the gate chained and the loop lights dark and nobody in. Marcus thought there'd be folks on that road by tomorrow who had children in the car. They were both right in a way that I couldn't argue with either one of them. And I didn't try, because I was standing there with my hand on a cooler lid doing math about vials. We set the rules that night on the porch. The marine box lives inside the store, in the corner away from the window. It gets opened twice a day, at first light and at last light, for 10 seconds. Nobody opens it but me. Not because I'm anybody, but because there had to be one person. And I was the one with the keys and the thermometer and 19 years of knowing which door on that property swelled in humidity. Everybody agreed. It's a good rule. I'd give the same rule today. It's also the only reason the rest of it worked. And I knew that when I proposed it. Not in words, but I knew it. Just before dark, Denny came up from the dock at a walk, which for him was strange, and said there were people on the beach. We went down through the lower loop to the swim area, 6 of us, and stayed back in the tree line by the bathhouse. The lake was down about 4 feet from the drought, which had been a running joke all summer, because it had opened up a hard sand shelf all the way around the west arm, where there used to be brush and drop-offs. You could walk from Farrell's Landing to our dock in 40 minutes on that shelf if you wanted to. All summer people had been walking it, and I'd been telling them to watch for the rebar out from the old crib. There were 3 of them coming down the shelf from the north, single file, in the last of the light. They didn't have anything with them. No packs, no bags, nothing in their hands, which is the detail that sat wrong before anything else did. Because nobody walks 2 miles of open shoreline in August without a water bottle. The one in front was in a yellow shirt. They came even with our swim buoys. And one of them went into the water up to about the knees and stopped there and stood, facing out at the lake, and the other 2 kept going south past the dock and into the dark by the culvert. Nobody said anything for a long minute. Then Corinne took Sadie's shoulder and turned her around and walked her back up the hill. And Sadie let her. And that told me more about how the day had gone than anything else. Marcus said, "Quiet. That's the way they'll come then." I said the lake would come up with the fall rain and close that shelf off. He said, "That's a ways off, Ray." I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I went down to the store with a flashlight and my keys, and I opened the marine box on the floor in the corner with the door shut behind me. I'd packed it that evening in front of 2 other people. Sadie's 3 boxes in first, like he said, in a plastic grocery bag. Down in the bottom were the cold pools. Then Marcus's 4 vials and his 2 pens in a second bag. Then ice on top, and the towel, and the lid down. 10 seconds, latched. At 2 in the morning, I took the ice off, and I took out 2 of Marcus's 4 vials, and I put them in the foam cooler with a split lid. And I put my 5 in the bag where his had been, with the labels turned in because the tape on mine had no name, and there was no way to look at that bag and count what belonged to who without pulling every vial out and reading it. And nobody was ever going to do that, because nobody was ever going to open that box but me. Then I carried the foam cooler up the hill in the dark and set it in the overflow trough of the spring box, in the 2 inches of water that were still moving, with a flat rock on the lid. 61 degrees. I had the thermometer in my pocket the whole time, and I did not take it out, because I already knew what it said, and because a man can hold 2 ideas at once if he's careful about which one he looks at. I told myself it was for Nell. That's the honest version of what I said inside my own head on that hill. And I'd like it to be a better sentence than it is. If I went down, there was nobody at Pike Hollow who knew how to run the pump off the generator without stalling it, or which cabin had the shut-off for the bathhouse, or where the fire road came out on the state forest side. 15 people, my daughter in the store with the radio. 2 years of never saying the word out loud. And the first day of the worst thing that ever happened to us was not going to be the day I stood on that porch and said, "By the way." In the morning, I opened the box at first light, with everybody standing around the way they would every morning after that, for 10 seconds. And I closed it and latched it. And Corinne asked how it looked in there. I said, "Cold. The girls and Marcus's are fine." Marcus, sitting on the step with his coffee, said good, and reached over and knocked twice on the lid with his knuckle, the way you'd pat a dog. Day 2, we learned what the store was actually for. Not the shelves, the building. It's cinder block with a slab floor and 1 window facing north, and by 9 in the morning it was the coolest room on the property by 6 degrees. And by afternoon it was the only place a person could stand without sweating through a shirt. So that's where the box lived, in the back corner. And that's where people drifted. And that's how a camp store with no power became a room where 13 adults and 4 kids kept ending up, whether they had a reason or not. Alan Bircher had a reason. He came in at 7 with a look I'd seen on contractors who show up to bid a job and find out the foundation's cracked. His 4 coolers had gone to slush overnight. Not melted, slumped, the way a cooler does when it's parked on a picnic table in August with nothing in it but ice and air. He'd known it would happen. He'd been out there at 5 moving them into the shade of the van. And by 6, he'd figured out the shade moved and the van didn't. "We need it all in one place," he said. "Every bit of cold we have in the best box we have. You spread it out, you lose it 3 times as fast." He wasn't wrong. He was righter than he knew, actually. A cooler holds cold in proportion to how full it is and how good its walls are. And we had 1 good box and 5 bad ones. And every bad one we kept running was a small fire we were feeding. I said, "And if that 1 box gets left open or dropped, or a tree comes down on the store roof, we've got nothing." Nell was behind the counter with her arms folded. "Dad, what are the odds of a tree coming down on the store roof?" "Better than they were on Friday." She let it go, but not the way you let a thing go when you're convinced. She let it go the way you do when your father is being stubborn in front of company, and you'll take it up later. Alan looked at me for a second longer than he needed to. And then he said, "All right." And we compromised on a thing that sounded like planning, and was actually me buying time. The marine box was the primary. The 2 decent Bircher coolers became a secondary, holding bottled water and the last of the popsicles for the kids, out on the shaded north side of the store. The foam ones we'd use as haulers and nothing else. Nobody asked what was in the trough up at the spring box, because nobody had gone up there but me since 1998. Denny Voss fixed the whole problem that afternoon. And he did it by being 22. He came into the store while I was trying to figure out how much fuel the generator burned an hour and said, "So can't we just freeze water?" I said the freezers were dead. He said, "They're dead 'cause they're off." I sat there a second. Then I got up and went out to the shed. Here's what we worked out over the next 2 hours, and I'll keep it short because it took us longer to do than it will to say. The generator couldn't run the ice machine. It could run 1 chest freezer easy, and a chest freezer with nothing in it but 8 half-gallon jugs of water will freeze them solid if you give it long enough. Long enough turned out to be most of a night. Fuel we had 11.5 gallons of, counting the mower jug plus whatever we could pull out of the vehicles, and the generator drank about 1/3 of a gallon an hour at that load. So we could make cold. We could turn gasoline into ice at a rate you could write on a piece of paper. And when the gasoline was gone, we could not make any more. And every jug we froze was a jug we could rotate into the marine box the next evening to replace one that had gone soft. Alan did the arithmetic out loud, and then stopped doing it out loud when he got to the part where it ended. He also told us the thing that mattered more than any of it. And he told it fast, standing at the counter with a jug in each hand. Insulin can't freeze. Cold keeps it, but freezing kills it dead. And once it's frozen, there's nothing to see and no way to test it. So the jugs could never touch the bags. Towel on the bottom, bags on the towel, towel over the bags, jugs on top and along the sides where the walls were, never against the medicine. And the corner nearest the ice was a place you did not put anything you cared about. Sadie said, "So it can be too cold." "It can be too cold," Alan said. "That's how people ruin it at home. They shove it in the back of the fridge by the vent and then wonder why they're running high in July." She thought about that, So if somebody's running high, that could be why. That could be why, he said. I remember exactly where I was standing when he said it. I was at the end of the counter with my hand on the freezer lid, and I heard a door open that I had not gone looking for. We ran the generator the first night from full dark until about 2 in the morning. In the morning, there were 5 more of them on the shelf. I need to explain the shelf, because it's the whole geography of what happened, and I've been putting it off. Sable Lake was down 4 feet that summer, worst since the 80s. When it drops like that on the west arm, it uncovers a hard sand bench that runs almost unbroken from Farrell's Landing 2 miles north all the way down past our swim area to the culvert at the south end. Flat, firm, walkable. All summer people had been strolling it in the evening with their shoes in their hands. I'd been telling every one of them the same thing since June watch for the rebar sticking up out of the old crib by the point. Somebody's going to open a foot on it. That bench was a sidewalk that came directly to us, and it existed because of a drought. And nothing about the world ending was going to raise the lake. The 5 new ones had come down from the north and stopped roughly even with the swim buoys, spread out over maybe 40 yards, most of them a step or 2 into the water. The one in the yellow shirt from the first night was still there, hadn't moved, sunk into about mid-shin where the sand gives way to silt off the end of the bench. That was worth knowing. On the hard sand they moved fine. In the soft stuff they got stuck and stayed stuck. And if the water got past their knees, they'd stand there and lean and not correct. They came when there was noise. Not right away, not fast. But the generator ran 5 hours, and by morning we had 5 more, and the next night we didn't run it and nothing changed. And by the 3rd day, nobody needed convincing. So that was the price list. A night of generator was 8 jugs of ice and some unknown number of new arrivals on the beach. Denny went out on the shelf on day 3 against everything Corinne and I said because he wanted to see. He came back up through the lower loop, white around the mouth, and sat on the store step for a while before he said anything. Then he said the one in the yellow shirt was Cody Farrell. I knew that family. Sold them ice, sold them minnows, pulled their pontoon off our ramp twice. Cody was 19 and worked at the marina. And if Cody Farrell was standing in 3 feet of water 2 miles from home, then Farrell's Landing wasn't a place we'd be walking to for help. Corinne Rule heard that and started keeping Sadie above the lower loop. Not dramatically. She just started finding reasons. Cards on the store porch, a puzzle on the picnic table by the pump house. Sadie noticed inside of a day and didn't fight it, which I think bothered Corinne more than fighting would have. The Prathers left on the 4th day. Jean and Bev, retired, Site 22, been coming since before I worked there. Jean had a heart thing and a bottle of pills that was going to run out in 3 weeks, and he said he'd rather spend the gas now than later. And I agreed with him, and I opened the gate for them and closed it behind, and that put us at 13. Bev hugged Nell. Jean shook my hand and said, "You've got a good little operation here, Ray." There was a certain amount of that in the first week. People kept telling me we were doing well. We were doing well. The bathhouse tank got filled twice a day off short pump runs. The lake gave us all the water we could boil. The thawed hamburger got cooked off in a day and a half, and the rest went in a pit. The chest freezer made ice at night and gave it up in the morning. Twice a day, first light and last light, I opened the marine box for 10 seconds in front of whoever was standing there and swapped a jug and latched it. And everyone watched me do it like it was a small ceremony, which I suppose it was. The reason it looked good is that the whole thing was running on stored cold and stored gasoline. And both of those were just numbers going down. Marcus finished his second pen on the 6th day. He came up the hill at 5:30 like always, with a little blue cooler under his arm out of pure habit even though there was nothing to put in it. And he sat on the step and told me the pen was empty and asked me to get him a vial out of the box when I did the morning open. I said I'd bring it down to him. I went up the hill in the dark first, through the wet ferns behind the cabin, and lifted the flat rock off the split lid of the foam cooler sitting in the trough, and took out one of his 2 vials. The water around it had gone still enough that there was a skin of green on the concrete. My thermometer said 66. I'd like to tell you I stood there and had a long argument with myself. What I actually did was put the vial in my shirt pocket and walked down and hand it to him on the porch, and he held it up to the light out of habit the way you do, and thanked me, and I said, "Don't." He'd been saying "don't" back to me for 19 years. Then he said, "Your shoes are soaked." I said I'd been down checking the dock lines. Marcus looked at my shoes, which had fern seed and a green smear of moss on them and no lake sand at all. And he said, and drank his coffee. That was the 6th day. By the 8th, his numbers were wrong. Sadie caught it first because Sadie was the only person on the property with a meter. And the meter had come to be a community instrument. She had about 40 strips when this started, and she was the one who decided, on her own, without telling Corinne, that she'd test twice a day instead of 5 times so that Marcus could have some. 12-year-olds do things like that and then don't mention them. And you find out 4 days later, and there's nothing you can do about it except feel the way I felt. Marcus's morning number came up over 300. He said he'd eaten funny. The next morning, it was worse. He took his usual amount, and by afternoon he was drinking water like a man who'd been out in a field, and getting up twice a night. And by the 10th day, he had that gray look around the eyes. And he'd stopped making jokes about the stool the campground owed him. Alan called it before lunch on the 10th day. He stood in the store with the vial in his hand and turned it and said it looked exactly like every other vial he'd ever handled. Because that's the thing. It always does. "It's not working like it should," he said. Which means somewhere along the line, that one got hot or it got frozen. And there it was, sitting in the middle of the room, both doors open, mine to choose. Nell said, "It's been in the box since day 1. "Then it's the box," Alan said. "Either a jug sat against it, or it's been up against that cold wall, or it got hot before it got here." He looked at me, not accusing, just running the list. "Ray, when you're rotating, where do the jugs sit?" I told him. "Corners and walls, never on the bags, towel between." "Then a jug shifted," he said. "That's all it takes. Latch it up, drive around a corner, the jug slides." Corinne said, "Nobody's driving anywhere." Somebody carried that box up a hill on day 1. I did carry it up a hill on day 1. Marcus carried it, and then I carried it inside. And either one of those trips is enough to slide a half-gallon jug of water 4 inches, and every person in that room accepted the explanation inside of a minute, because it was a good explanation, and because it was nobody's fault, and because people would rather it be nobody's fault. I let it stand, not with a lie, with a nod and a sentence about how we'd change the packing so it couldn't shift. And I went and cut up a foam display cooler with a utility knife and built dividers inside the marine box so the jugs couldn't move. And everybody said that was smart. It was smart. I've never done a smarter thing for a worse reason. That's the part I'd take back before I'd take back the swap, if I got one. The swap was a bad thing I did at 2 in the morning with my hands. The nod was a bad thing I did at 11 in the morning with my whole face in a lit room with time to think. That afternoon we consolidated. The group decided it, and it was the right decision. and I couldn't argue against it without a reason I was willing to say out loud. Everything cold, every last bit of medicine on the property, into the one good box, packed my way with the dividers, opened twice a day by me, with a second person present. Alan volunteered to be the second person. Corinne said it should rotate so it wasn't the same two men every time. And Alan said that was fair. And it did rotate after that. And it made not one bit of difference, because I was the one who'd packed it. I brought Marcus's last Springbox vial down in my shirt pocket and put it in the bag in front of Nell and Alan, and said that was the last of what had been out. And then, standing there with the lid open and two people looking into the box with me, I did the thing that I have not been able to explain to myself in a way I'd say to a stranger. I took one of mine out of the bottom bag and put it in Marcus's. It was one motion. It looked like tidying. Alan was counting jugs. Marcus was better in 2 days. That's what did the damage in the end. If he'd stayed sick, somebody would have kept asking questions. Instead, he came up the hill on the 12th morning with color in his face and said his number was 138. And he sat on the step and told a long story about a man he'd worked with at the elevator in 1988 who could sleep standing up. And everybody laughed. And Alan looked pleased with himself in a modest way. And the theory of the shifting jug became the settled history of what had happened at Pike Hollow. I had 3 vials left that nobody knew about, and one of them was already in Marcus's bag, with the sticker peeled off. I peeled the stickers with my thumbnail in the store at night. Little curls of paper with my name and the pharmacy's phone number in Ostrander. I burned them in the fire ring at Site 3, and stirred the ash with a stick like a man who'd been raised to be careful. And I want to be clear that I knew what I was doing when I did it. There's no version of peeling a label off a vial at midnight that a person does absently. I stretched myself starting around the 11th day. Not dramatically. A person on my kind of insulin doesn't fall down in an afternoon. You take less than you should, and your body runs high, and you feel like you've got the flu that never turns into anything. You're thirsty. You get up at night. Your legs ache in the mornings, and your feet go numb around 3 in the afternoon, and you sit down on the store step and tell yourself it's the heat. And it is the heat, partly. That's the trouble with it. Everything I felt had a second explanation available. And we were all sleeping 4 hours a night and eating out of cans and hauling lake water uphill in 5-gallon buckets. And there wasn't a person on that property who felt good. Except I was drinking about 1.5 gallons a day out of a bathhouse tank that 13 people were sharing, and Nell keeps books. She caught me on the 13th night, filling a jug at the tank spigot after everybody else had gone down. She stood at the corner of the bathhouse with a flashlight she didn't turn on and said, "That's your 3rd one today. It's 94 degrees. It was 94 degrees last week, and you drank what everybody drank." She came over and looked at the jug, and then at me. "You've lost weight. Everybody's lost weight. Your belt's on a different hole than it was in June, Dad. Not last week. June." I told her I was tired. She stood there a while and let me hear how thin that was. And then she said, "Is it your heart?" And God help me, that was the moment. She'd handed me the door. All I had to do was say, "No, it's not my heart. It's this other thing. I've had it 2 years. I've got 2 vials left. And there's a reason I never told you." She was standing 3 feet from me in the dark, and she had already gotten herself ready to hear something bad. She'd braced. I watched her do it. I said it wasn't my heart. I'd had a physical in the spring, and my heart was fine, and that I'd sleep more. She said, "Okay." Then she said, "You know what it does to me when you do that." She went up the hill. I stood at the spigot with a jug I didn't want anymore. The rain started as a possibility on the 15th day. Not rain, a change in the air. and a hard purple line along the west ridge in the evening, and the barometer in the store, which is a brass thing screwed to the wall that the Lambs bought at an antique place and that I'd never once seen move more than a hair, sitting noticeably lower than it had that morning. Every drought I've been through breaks the same way. It doesn't rain a half-inch a day for a week and soak in. It comes in one shot, 2 or 3 inches in a night, and it doesn't soak in at all because the ground's baked hard as a driveway. And it all runs downhill at once. I knew what that would do to the springboks. I'd seen it in 2011. A dry seep doesn't come back cold and clear. It comes back through cracks that have been open all summer, carrying everything off that hillside. And it fills the box with a warm surface water and a foot of silt, and it runs over the trough for 2 days. There was nothing left in the trough by then, except a foam cooler with a split lid and no medicine in it. I told myself I'd go up and get it, and I didn't. Because going up there in daylight with everybody in the yard was exactly the thing I'd spent 2 weeks not doing. Gene Prather came back on the 16th day. He came down the fire road on foot at 4 in the afternoon, alone, in the same shirt he'd left in 11 days earlier. And Denny got to him first with a shovel in his hands, and then dropped it and helped him up the last stretch. Gene had walked 8 miles. His shoes were done. He drank about a quart of water on the store step before he'd say anything, and then what he said was, "There's a station at the fairgrounds. Delft County Fairgrounds, out on the east side, past Ostrander. Generators and a fence and people in vests running it, taking anybody who walked up, and a medical tent with a working refrigerator." And Bev was there, and had been for 9 days on her heart pills with more where those came from. And he'd have stayed. He came back because there were 15 people down this hole who didn't know it existed, and because the road in was gone. That was the part he made sure we understood before anything else. County 9 was blocked at the top, and had been for a week. And the state route through Dell's Corner had 100 of them standing in it. And there was no walking a 12-year-old and a 61-year-old man out of here on foot. But the lake wasn't blocked. Down the west arm, around the point, across the wide water to the state ramp on the east side. And from the ramp it was 2.5 miles of township road to the fairgrounds gate. 6 hours in a boat with 2 people rowing, maybe 5. And when the rain came, Gene said, the lake would come up and lift the boats off the mud, and it would put 4 feet of water over that sand shelf, and everything standing on it would be standing in a lake. There was about a minute of pure relief in that yard. I want that on the record, because it's the only minute of it we got. Nell laughing. Alan sitting down on the step with his hand over his mouth. Sadie asking Gene twice whether the refrigerator at the medical tent was a real refrigerator or a cooler, and Gene saying it was a real one, white with a magnet on it, and Sadie saying, "Okay," and looking at her grandmother. Then Corinne Rule turned around and said the thing that everything after ran on. "Then Sadie goes on the first boat," she said, "and we'll need the box. Not a cooler, not one of the foam ones or one of Alan's. 6 hours on open water in the middle of August, then 2.5 miles up a road on foot, carrying everything that kid needed to stay alive, in a boat that would be sitting in the sun with no shade on it anywhere." She meant the marine box. There was no other box on that property that could do it. And everybody in the yard knew it inside of 2 seconds. And everybody in the yard agreed with her, including me, because she was right. Marcus said, "Take it." Alan was already saying we'd need to freeze every jug we could tonight, run the generator until the fuel was gone. It didn't matter now. And Denny was asking which boat and whether the outboard would run. And Gene was drawing the point and the crossing on the back of a rental form with a golf pencil. And I stood there in my own yard, 16 days into the worst thing that ever happened to me, and understood that in about 12 hours, I was going to have to open that box in front of everyone, unpack it down to the towel, and hand it over. We ran the generator from dark until the fuel was gone. That was Alan's call, and nobody fought it. 11 gallons, minus what Jean's walk told us we'd never need for anything else, poured into that little engine in one night to make ice we could carry. 8 jugs in the freezer, then 8 more when the first set froze through. Then 6 because the fuel ran short of a full third batch. 22 half-gallon jugs of solid ice stacked on the store floor at 4 in the morning, sweating already, and the generator ticking as it cooled in the shed. They came for the noise the way they always did. By 2, you could see them out past the swim buoys and the flashes off the west ridge, more than we'd ever had at once. And Denny stood at the bathhouse corner counting them out loud until Corinne told him to stop. I went up the hill at 3, in the first of the rain. I want to say I went up for a reason a decent man would have. I went up because in about 5 hours, we were going to open the marine box in front of everybody. And because there was a foam cooler with a split lid sitting in the overflow trough behind the caretaker's cabin. And because a person who has been lying for 2 weeks stops thinking about anything except the shape of the lie. The seep had already turned. You could hear it before you got to it. 3 weeks of nothing. And then an inch of rain on ground, baked hard as a slab. And it wasn't soaking in anywhere. It was running. And the box was full to the lip with water the color of coffee with milk in it. The trough was gone under a sheet of it. Silt and fern litter and a dead crawler going around in a slow circle where the knots used to be. The cooler wasn't there. I put the light down along the runoff channel, and I could see where it had gone. A scrape through the moss and a fern bent flat. And then the channel drops into the culvert pipe that runs under the upper loop and comes out behind the bathhouse. And I stood there in the rain, with water coming over my shoes, and understood that the hill had taken it out of my hands and put it 30 feet from where 13 people slept. I got about halfway down before I had to sit on the step of Site 19 and put my head between my knees. That was the first time I couldn't lie to myself about it. Not tired. My mouth was full of something like pennies, and my legs had gone stupid, and the rain felt good on my neck in a way rain shouldn't. I sat there long enough that the sky went from black to the color of a nickel, and I got up because sitting was worse. Sadie found her cooler at 6. It had come out of the culvert and lodged sideways in the gravel where the bathhouse downspout puts a fan of stones every spring, and it was upside down with the split lid still bungeed to it and the dial thermometer still taped inside. And she picked it up with 2 hands and turned it over and said, "This is mine." She wasn't accusing anybody. She was 12, and she'd found her own cooler 30 yards from where it should never have been. And she was working on it out loud, the way she worked on everything. "How'd it get up there?" she said. Corinne came over. Then Nell with the tarp she'd been carrying. Then Alan, because Alan came to anything that looked like a conversation. And I stood at the store door with my hand on the frame, and I watched 4 people look at a foam cooler. And the thing I remember most clearly is that not one of them looked at me. Not yet. They were all still trying to think of a reason a cooler would be up the hill. And reasons are easy to think of when you like somebody. Nell said, "Maybe it got put in the shed and the water moved it." Alan said the shed's downhill. Then the sky opened. It came the way it always comes after a drought, all at once and sideways. And everything got very simple for about 2 hours. We had 4 kids and a tarp and a store roof and a lake that was going to come up faster than anybody but me and Jean expected, because 1,100 acres of hardpan farmland north of us was going to shed everything it got straight into the west arm. The boats were the emergency. 12 rentals chained to a shore that had been mud all summer and was about to be underwater. And if you let an aluminum boat fill with rain and then let the lake come up under it, you'll find it on the bottom with the chain still on. Denny and Jean and I went down and bailed and unchained and dragged them up the bank in the rain with the lake already 3 inches higher than it had been at the Mironite. You could see it moving. You could stand there and watch a line of wet sand disappear. And out past the swim buoys, the ones that had been standing in the shallows for 2 weeks stopped standing. I've thought about how to say this without making it sound like more than it was. They didn't swim. They didn't do anything. The bench filled in, and the water came up past their waists, and they leaned the way they'd been leaning, and the water took them. And they came into the swim area sideways, slow, turning, the way a log comes in. One of them went into the buoy line and stayed there, tangled. 2 went under the dock and hung up in the cribbing, and we could hear them against the boards for the rest of the day. An irregular knock you stopped hearing after the first hour, and then heard again every time you stopped talking. Cody Farrell's yellow shirt went past the end of the dock and kept going south toward the culvert and out of sight. And Denny watched it the whole way with the bail bucket in his hand. Jean said we had to go tonight. He was right, and everybody could see he was right without any argument. The lake coming up was the only reason the boats could launch off the ramp instead of 40 feet of mud. And it was the reason the shelf was gone. And by tomorrow, the water would be into the lower loop, and the current at the culvert would be something you didn't want to be near in a rowboat. One night. Take it or spend a month finding out what came next. So at 4 in the afternoon, in the rain, under a tarp strung between the store porch posts and the ice machine that hadn't run in 17 days, we opened the box to pack it for the crossing. Alan did the packing because Alan knew the medicine. I did the ice because I knew the box. Corinne held the light. Nell had a pencil and the back of a rental form because somebody had to write down what went in which boat. And Marcus sat on his blue cooler with his elbows on his knees, watching the way he'd watched me come down that hill with the keys for 19 summers. We took everything out down to the bare towel. 22 jugs on the porch boards, Sadie's bag, Marcus's bag, and Alan started counting, out loud, because that's what you do when 4 people are watching, and one of them is a grandmother. He got through Sadie's. 3 unopened boxes, 1 pen with maybe a third left, the meter, 11 strips, then Marcus's bag. And he laid them out on the towel in a row, the way a man does when he's been laying things out on counters his whole working life. And he stopped. He picked up the 3rd one and turned it and set it down, and picked up the 5th one and turned that one too. "Marcus," he said, "when'd you take the labels off these?" Marcus said, "I didn't take any labels off anything." There was maybe 4 seconds where nobody had thought of anything yet. Alan held one up. Bare glass, a little tacky where the adhesive had been. One thin curl of paper still stuck under the cap ring where a thumbnail hadn't reached. He said, "This has been peeled. Both of these have." And Corinne Rule, who had spent 31 years in a school office watching people explain things, moved the light off the towel and put it on me. I could have kept going. I want to be honest about that, because people always assume there's a moment where the truth kicks the door in, and you couldn't have stopped it. I could have said I peeled them because the labels were coming off in the wet, and I didn't want paper in the box. That's a good answer. It would have held for a day, and by then we'd have been on the water. And after that, we'd have been at a fairgrounds with a white refrigerator and a magnet on it, and none of it would have mattered. What stopped me was Sadie's cooler, sitting on the end of the porch where she'd left it, upside down with the dial thermometer taped inside. I said, 2 of those aren't Marcus's. Nobody said anything. I said, They're mine. And then I stood in my own campground, in the rain, and told 13 people something I hadn't told my daughter in 2 years and 4 months, which is that I'm a diabetic, that I have been since the spring after her mother died, that there were 5 vials of mine in that bin on the bottom shelf of the store cooler on the 9th of August with no name on the tape, and that on the first night, at 2 in the morning, with the door shut, I took 2 of Marcus Fenn's out of the good box and put 2 of mine in their place and carried his up the hill and set them in the trough at the spring box in 61-degree water that I had measured myself that afternoon and told everyone was fine. I said the rest of it too, because once it started, there's no version where you stop halfway. That the spring wasn't cold, that I knew it wasn't cold when I put his in it, that when he got sick on the 10th day and Alan said a jug must have shifted, I didn't say anything. And then I went and built dividers out of a cut-up display cooler so that everyone would keep believing it. That I put one of mine into his bag when we consolidated, which is the only reason he came back around, and that I've been short ever since and hiding that too. Alan said quietly, "That's why he got better in 2 days." I said yes. Nell put the pencil down on the porch rail. She didn't do it hard. She set it down and squared it up with the rail like she was going to need to find it later. And she said, "I asked you at the bathhouse. I asked you if it was your heart." I said, "I know." She said, "You let me stand there and be scared of the wrong thing." That's the sentence. Out of everything anybody said to me that day, that's the one I still have. She walked out from under the tarp into the rain and stood at the end of the porch with her back to us. And Corinne, God bless her, and I mean that, Corinne started giving orders, because there was a boat to load and a 12-year-old going into open water in the dark. And there is a kind of person who understands that a moral reckoning is not an emergency, and the weather is. She said, "Alan, does any of this change what goes in the box?" Alan looked at the towel for a while. He said no. Sadie's goes in first, in the bottom, in the middle, dividers in, jugs at the walls, exactly the way it's been. He said the packing was never the problem. He said it in a flat voice. And I understood he was going back through 2 weeks of his own certainty and finding my hands in it. Corinne said, "Then load it." Marcus hadn't moved off his cooler. He said, "Ray, come here." I went over. He held out his bag, the one with his 4 in it, and the 2 that were mine and the 2 he thought were his. And he said, "Take 2 of these." I said no. He said, "You're gray. You've been gray for a week, and I thought it was the water." He pushed the bag at me. "I'm not doing this on the porch." I said no again, and he said, "Then I'll say it in front of everybody, and you'll take them anyway, and it'll be worse." Here's what he understood before I did, and I think he understood it in about the time it took Alan to say the word peeled. 2 of the vials he was holding were already mine. He'd been alive on my medicine for 6 days, and I'd been walking around on the short end of it for 2 weeks, badly, in front of him, while he ate my share and got his color back, and told his story about the man who could sleep standing up. He said, "If you go down in that boat tonight, nobody gets around the point." I took 2. That's the worst thing that happened to me at Pike Hollow. And I know how that sounds next to what happened to other people. A man I'd stolen from handed it back to me on a porch in the rain, in front of my daughter. And he was right too. And everybody there could see he was right too. And there was no way in the world to refuse it. That wasn't just me protecting how I felt. We launched at 9. 2 boats, both 16-foot aluminum rentals, rowed. Because every drop of gas on the property had gone through the generator to make the ice that was now packed around Sadie's bag. Boat 1. Denny and Alan on the oars, Corinne in the stern, Sadie in the bow with the marine box between her feet and her arms over the lid. Boat 2. Jean and Nell rowing, Marcus in the stern, me in the bow with a flashlight. The lake had come up better than 3 feet by then, and it was still coming. The ramp was underwater to the top of the apron. We floated the boats off the grass. The point is a half-mile north. There's an old log crib out from it that used to hold the ice off the shore back when there was a fishing camp there in the 50s. And it's rotted down to nothing but the iron. And there are 3 pieces of rebar standing up out of it, about as thick as your thumb. All summer they'd been dry, out of the water, with a plastic milk jug I'd wired to the tallest one in June. Every year at that level I'd tell people to watch it. Every year, somebody didn't. 3 feet of new water put all 3 of them just under the surface, and the milk jug with them. And there is no line, no ripple, no way to see it in the dark in the rain. I knew where it was the way you know where the last step on your own basement stairs is, not by looking. You line up the dead cottonwood on the point with the gap in the ridge behind it, and you stay outside that line until the cottonwood covers the gap, and then you're past. I couldn't see the ridge, cloud to the ground and rain in my face. So I did the only thing left, which was count. I put boat 1 on my light, and I called them off the shore by feel, and by the sound of the water on the rocks at the point, which changes, and by 19 years of pulling a mower around that shoreline. And I put them wide, wider than they needed to be. And Denny swore at me twice about the extra distance, and I let him. Yeah. They cleared it. I heard Alan say something, and then Corinne's voice. And then they were past and swinging east into the wide water. And Sadie's light came on in the bow, like they'd agreed. 1 flash and off, and that was them gone. Boat 2 came around 8 minutes behind them. I stood up in the bow to call the line, and my legs went out from under me. That's all. I've had 2 weeks to build up to a sentence about it, and there isn't one. I was standing, and then I was down across the middle thwart, with the flashlight gone over the side, and Nell shouting, and the boat swinging in the chop. And by the time Jean got it straight again, we had drifted maybe 40 feet inside where I'd have put us. We hit the crib. Not hard. There was a sound like somebody hitting the hull with a hammer once, and then a long tearing that wasn't loud at all. And then Jean said, "We're open." It came in fast, not sinking in a movie fast, just faster than 3 people could bail in a boat that was already carrying water from the rain. Marcus got his coat off and got it over the tear and got about 1/3 of it, and Nell was rowing us in toward the point with everything she had. And Jean bailed, and I lay in the bilge and did nothing whatsoever, which I'd like to say I've made peace with. We got to the rocks at the point with the gunwale about 4 inches out. We got out into water to our chests and got the boat up on the rocks and turned over. And Denny came back for us an hour later, after he'd put boat 1 on the far side of the wide water, where it was calm, and made Corinne swear she'd stay put with the box. What we lost went to the bottom in 11 feet of water off the crib. 2 jugs of ice, Jean's shoes, my thermometer, out of my shirt pocket when I went over the thwart, the yellow cord and all, $4.99 off the tackle rack, that I'd used to write the water temperature on the chalkboard by the store door every morning for 6 years, and to tell myself the spring box was good enough on the 9th of August. And Marcus's bag. He'd had it inside his coat. The coat went over the tear in the hull with everything still in the pocket. And by the time anybody thought about it, we were standing in the lake holding a boat, and nobody was going back down for a bag in the dark on the crib iron. 4 vials. 2 of them mine, 2 of them his, and no way anymore to tell you which 2 were which is a joke I don't find funny. He didn't say a word about it, Not on the rocks, not in the 2 trips it took Denny to ferry us across, not on the township road in the morning, not at the fairgrounds gate. When the woman in the vest at the medical tent asked him what he needed, he told her the truth in about 9 words and got in line. They had some, not much. They had a white refrigerator with a magnet on it, just like Jean said, and a list. And Marcus went on the list, and he was 6 days before they could give him anything like enough. 6 days at the end of August in a horse barn with a fan in the doorway at 61 years old, with a man he'd known for 19 summers, sitting on the next cot getting his because Marcus had put it in his hand on a porch. He came through it. I want to be clear about that. He's alive, but there was a stretch in there that took something out of him that hasn't come back. And his feet aren't what they were, and he doesn't stand for long anymore. And every single person who has heard this story has done the arithmetic on that and reached the same place I have and been polite enough not to say it. Sadie made it with a full box. That's the true thing at the bottom of all of it. And I've tried to lean on it, and it won't hold my weight. She walked into that medical tent with 3 unopened boxes at 51 degrees after 6 hours on the water and 2.5 miles of road, because a man named Alan Bircher stole 50 pounds of ice at 3 in the morning on the 9th of August, and because Marcus Fenn set his own box down on my porch and said put the girls in first before anyone had asked him for anything. The one thing I did that helped, I'd have done anyway. The dividers work. They still use them. Somebody at the fairgrounds copied the idea off ours, and there are 4 boxes packed that way in the county now. And about once a month, somebody who doesn't know me tells me it's a good design. Nell went to work in the supply tent because Nell keeps books. We're in the same place. We eat at the same table 2 or 3 times a week. And she asks me how I'm doing. And I tell her, the number and everything. And she writes it down and says, okay. She's civil. She's more than civil. But there was a way she used to talk to me about nothing at all. About a customer who bought $40 of firewood, about a song. And that stopped in the rain on the 9th day of the storm. And it has not started again in 11 months. And I've quit waiting for it to. She asked me one time, in October, whether I'd have told her if the labels had stayed on. I said I didn't know. That was the honest answer, and it was also the wrong one. And I could see her decide something. They asked me to run the cold storage at the new place the first week, because of the dividers, and because I know boxes. I said no, and then I had to explain why, in a tent, to 2 people who hadn't heard any of it. And that's how it got around. I'm not going to pretend I confessed to that county the way I've confessed to you. It came out sideways over about 3 months, in pieces, mostly from me and some from Denny. And there are people here who think I'm a man who kept 15 people alive at a campground for 17 days. And there are people here who won't hand me anything they need back. Here's what I do now. There are 2 keys to the medical box, and there is always a second person, and the second person is never the same one twice in a row. That's the rule I wrote, and it's the only thing I've ever pushed hard for since I got here. And I pushed for it before anybody knew why, which I'm not proud of either. And when it's my turn on the box, I unlatch it, and I lift the lid. And then I put my hands behind my back and step off to the side. And somebody else's arms go in. Sadie counts it most mornings. She's 13 now. She's fast at it, faster than Alan. And she reads the little dial out loud without being asked and writes it on the tag. And she doesn't need me standing there for any of it. I stand there anyway, with my hands behind my back, until she's done and the lid comes down.